Hey, Richard Flint, and I want to welcome you today to this section of human behavior, and because that's what I'm all about. So my podcast is entitled Let's Talk Human Behavior, because everything in life is about behavior. And the greatest contradiction that we face today is the contradiction between what people say and what they do. And so this has always made human behavior a topic that I focus on. And I am excited today because I get to have a conversation with a gentleman that I respect very much. I've had the privilege of talking to his people on one occasion and have followed him and respect him very much. And I'm talking about Sheriff David Clarke. And Sheriff Clarke, I am so honored to have you with me today.
Well, Richard, I'm humbled by that. I really am. Thanks for the wonderful introduction. It's kind of interesting when you mention human behavior. It's one of the more complex things to understand because it's so unpredictable. But at the same time, like you said, human behavior drives a lot of things in this world.
Well, I can take almost any situation that I've dealt with over the years, and the challenges are, for the word that people use a lot, the problems that people face. And I can always take it back to the contradiction between what is said and what is done. And that is always what has made human behavior so important to me.
There's no doubt about that. Oftentimes those two things don't align, as you know. And I think that's where a lot of the problems arise.
Yeah. So how would you define yourself? If someone's asked you, who is Sheriff David Clarke? How would you?
Well, it's interesting. As complex as anything else. Hard to nail down in terms of, I kind of like it that way. You hear a lot of times people say he's this, he's that. And the next thing you know, they look up and they say, wow, did you hear that? Did you see that? Where'd that come from? We, didn't see that coming. Multidimensional. I say what I mean. I mean what I say. I'm not afraid to take a position on certain things because I'm in that environment where people ask for my opinion and, being a former elected official, I retired after 40 years in law enforcement, whether it be the media or whether it be the people you serve, people always want to know what's on your mind, what's on my mind, and, my opinion and position on these things. And so being in that situation, oftentimes many of the things that people ask about or that I'm involved in are, they can be hot button issues. And anytime, as you know, you take a position on something, you're going to set yourself up for attack.
Yeah. Several people who are listening may not know exactly who you are. Tell my listeners here on Let's Talk Human Behavior, tell them a little bit about you and your career.
Sure. I spent 40 years in law enforcement, 24 years with the City of Milwaukee Police Department, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and then I was elected 4 times to be the Sheriff of Milwaukee County. Milwaukee County has a population of just under 1 million people, very diverse. It's an urban, blue-collar city. Many of the same issues with Milwaukee as any large urban area in terms of, crime, politics, that sort of thing. And, I'm the son of 2-parent household, mom and dad, who didn't have a lot, but did the best they could to raise their 5 kids to give them an opportunity to reach their full potential in life. They provided the base foundation, the platform, if you will, with the education. And, fortunately, my parents are still with me today. So they've gotten to see with many of their kids the fruits of their labor. And I'm real thankful for that. Right now, I've been involved. I'm still in the belly of the beast, so to speak. That's what I call politics. Still fighting the fight. And my fight isn't for people. I did support this President Donald Trump. I say did because I still do. But that's not it. I'm about, I remind people, make this about a movement. And that movement for me is freedom and liberty in America, support for the Constitution, support for Western values, Western culture. And of course, those are very lightning rod issues, but, I'm not going to be shied away by that. I'm fighting for the next generation of people. I had my time. I had my turn. I reached the pinnacle of my profession. Having been in law enforcement, I was the executive as the elected sheriff, and I got to lead an agency. So I got to set policy and all sorts of things. It's been a highlight of my life, really, is that I've been given the opportunity to serve my community where I grew up in that capacity.
Well, one of the things I know about you and that I admire within you is that you don't play games. And one of the things that this has resulted in is that to a lot of people, you are very controversial. So what do you think makes you so controversial?
Well, I kind of disagree with that. I'm going to push back on that a little bit. That's one of the terms that's used to describe me, controversial. Just the other day, I was in Michigan speaking at an event. I do a lot of public speaking still around the country. And the newspaper in that particular township in Michigan referred to me as polarizing. And, I look at these terms, I look at these phrases. People want to put you in a box and, define you in a certain way. And sometimes that, label can be, I think, a pejorative in terms of controversy. I'm not afraid of light. I'm not afraid of these things that many people who are in a position to make a difference, and that's what I've been, in a position to make a difference, they shy away from it because they know how hard it is. And they know what can come out of those sorts of things when you thrust yourself out there. But when I hear controversial, I say to myself, controversial to who? Heck, I got elected 4 times as Sheriff of Milwaukee County. You can't get elected to a position without public support. So apparently, I have enough support on my side, and I hear it everywhere I go. I have enough that, people are motivated by me. People appreciate what I'm doing with the platform that I have. And of course, Richard, you know this, and I know, what you meant by that reference to me, and I don't take it negatively at all. I say, here's the thing. In life, you're never going to please everybody. It's just not going to happen. You just have to, please enough people that people think that you're sincere, that you are qualified to say some of the things that you do, take on some of the things that you do. I think I've demonstrated that in life. And like I said, I got elected 4 times with over, 50% of the vote. So, yeah, of course. And a guy told me this once after my first campaign. He said, David, keep this in mind. He said, no matter what you do in this position, he said, 50% of the people are going to hate you for it. 50% are going to support you for it. So that's why I say, I asked that question when a guy said it the other day, why are you so polarizing? I said, polarizing to who? If I was that polarizing, I wouldn't get the invites that I do to speak, and I wouldn't have been as successful as I've been throughout my life.
David, when I listen to you talk, would it be accurate to say that one of the foundations about who you are is that you do not back down from what you believe?
You can't. I just, and it's what my parents taught me, all throughout my early upbringing. They used to say to me, stand for something. And I do. I stand for something. And I realize this too, Richard, that there are 2 schools of thought. And most of the time when I take the stage, take a platform, I remind the listening audience, hey, look, there are 2 schools of thought on these issues that I'm going to talk about today. You may be from one of those schools. I know that I am. You may be from a different school of thought on this, and that's okay. Because I think dissent is healthy in a democracy. I think opposing viewpoints are a good thing, not a bad thing. But I remind them of that so, just in case I say something, they go, well, I don't believe that, and I don't think. I go, that's fine. We can have that discussion later on. But you can't back down. There's a little bit of this element called courage when you're in the belly of the beast, and that's where I am. I'm in the belly of the beast, and you have to have courage, but you have to stand for something, and you have to be able to communicate that what you stand for to people, so at least they have an understanding. They may disagree, but at least they understand what you're talking about and where you're coming from.
David, is a big part of being willing to hear what's being said, even that if I don't agree with it, is the ability to listen with an open mind. And I may not agree with it, but even if I don't agree with it, there's always the opportunity to learn what's being said, correct?
Yeah, and that happens too often, unfortunately, in these, especially in the political environment, but not just the political environment, but too many people are talking past each other. They're talking over each other. Listening is just as important in communicating as talking is, but more often than not, people do too much talking and not enough listening. But that's what has driven me to be the reader that I am. You know, I read incessantly. I love to read. And actually, when you're reading, what you're doing is you're listening to somebody else. Somebody else put pen to paper and authored either a column, a story, a book, or whatever. And I find that more beneficial in terms of developing my listening skills than watching TV, because when you watch TV, you know, it's the hearing aspect, and that is probably not the best, you know, of our senses to use in communication, and the mouth is the other one. So when I read, it allows calmness, quiet, and it's through the eyes. And human beings are visual creatures. It's our strongest sense. So when you read, you're using your strongest sense to aid another one of your senses, and that's listening.
So what if you're reading something and you don't agree with what you're reading? How do you handle that?
Yeah, the mind's always working, which is why I find reading so fascinating. The mind is working as you're reading. But what I do is I start formulating questions that I hope later on, as I continue that reading, that the person who wrote that will explain. One of the things that I believe in doing, and I expect people to do it to me, is to poke holes in anything that I say, any of my opinions or positions. Poke holes in it, find weaknesses, and question me on that stuff. Because too often, all we really get from people are opinions, and anybody can have an opinion. But what I try to do is I state a position, and then I back it up with some research that I've done, some data that I can present to strengthen that. That doesn't mean it's the right thing. Oftentimes, I'll give you an example. Someone will state something to me, and the first question is, well, where did you get that from? You know, how did you come to that conclusion? And my the poking holes in it. You know, my hope is that they can say, well, hey, look, there was this research done over here, or this data over here says this, and this, to strengthen that argument. Because if there's no strength to the argument, then it's just an opinion, and anybody can have an opinion, and most opinions, as you know, Richard, are ill-informed and uninformed.
Would you say that many times the difference between an opinion and a belief is my depth of commitment to what I'm living inside me?
Yeah, I think precisely. You know, how committed are you to it? You know, how willing are you when people start to try to poke holes in it, you know, to continue to back that thing up, continue to believe until you learned enough counter information that it makes you say to yourself, and this is not a bad thing, to say, hey, you know what? There's some things I didn't take into consideration here, and let me go back. And that doesn't mean let me go back and change my position, but let me go back and strengthen my argument, strengthen my position with some further research. You know, there's no finish line to this stuff. It's always in support of, you know, future arguments, future positions. I mean, arguments not as a pejorative, but back and forth discourse. And you know, there'll never be this, you know, there are very few truths in life, you know, about life. You know, one of them is death, right? We all know there's nobody that's going to argue that someday we're not going to die. or that we are going to die. No, that's a truth, okay? But there are very few things like that in life. So the back and forth and the continuing and the strengthening of the arguments, to get to a certain position where some sound policy can be made. Sound policy, not based on politics and other things that lead to mistakes in drafting policy. And then even when you get to that policy, that doesn't mean it should be set in stone because things change, times change, information changes. And so always should be this ongoing, back and forth and discourse and discussion, because that's what life has been. If you think going back to the beginning of time, at least, historically documented time, things have changed throughout there. And so we've adjusted, we've gotten smarter, we have more intelligence now, we have more technology, but that has been the result of people pushing the envelope and not getting so dug down that all we do is talk over each other and talk past each other instead of talking to each other.
David, I'm a person with pretty strong beliefs, and I love it when people challenge my beliefs because it makes me think. It makes me have to go deep inside myself. But what I find with people who live in a world of opinions, you can't challenge their opinions. If you try to challenge their opinions, then they want to pick a verbal war with you. And I think that's one of the issues that we're facing today, is that so much of conversation is not based in beliefs, it's based in opinions.
Yeah, you're right. And that's when I know, when I get into a situation like that the person has no foundation to what they're saying. It's a sign to me. They try to deflect, as you say, they try to make it personal. They change the subject. And I know right away, which allows me to not escalate this argument or whatever, because it could turn dangerous, but to realize, this person hasn't really done any research. They have nothing to support it. It's an opinion, and we can have an opinion. There's nothing wrong with that. But I'll tell you what, you can't bring opinion to an intellectual argument. You'll get killed. And I don't mean, I'm talking about metaphorically. You won't be able to continue your argument. You'll have to change it. You'll have to attack, personal attacks. Those are the things that happen to me a lot in this political environment. And I know when that stuff starts right away, that this person has no foundation to their argument.
Yeah. I want to deal with three subjects with you today that are important to me, and I know they're important to you. When I travel, one of the things I'm seeing today, David, that I have never seen at the level that I'm seeing now is the anger in this country. And the anger is not something that just is, to me, it's something that's growing. And it's created a division in this country that runs deeper than I believe that most people understand, which has resulted in a major form of distrust. And a lot of that distrust right now in this country is focused on Washington, D.C. And it's creating, I think, and feeding the anger in our society today that we're more interested in winning a war than we are governing this country.
Yeah, and it's been very detrimental, I think, to the continued growth of this republic. But I try to remind people at the same time, when I do my public speaking, this country has been through other periods of turmoil, and except for historical documentation, we weren't there. But at the same time, because we weren't there, doesn't mean that it wasn't as much turmoil as it is today. And I'll give a couple of examples. The American Revolution, okay? When the Founding Fathers decided to declare their independence from the crown, not all of the colonists who lived here at the time were for that. They thought these guys were radicals. They didn't think living under the crown was all that bad. And, we went through a revolution to win our freedom from the crown. I'll give you another example, the Civil War and that ugly institution of slavery. Very contentious. a lot of turmoil at the time between the North and the South. Heck, so much turmoil, Richard, that the country went to war, and over 500,000 Americans died in the Civil War to end that ugly institution of slavery. And keep in mind that, half the country, the South, was for slavery, half the country, the North, was against slavery. And so those were very contentious times too. And then I point to, the two world wars that we have, a little different because other than the attack on Pearl Harbor, most of that was happening off the continental United States. But I'll give you another example, the turbulent 60s. If you go back to the 60s with the anti-government sentiment, with the anti-position of the war in Vietnam, very contentious, the riots of the 60s, very contentious period of time in the country. And so I use those as examples of what we're going through today. It's a defining moment. The American Revolution was a defining moment. The Civil War was a defining moment. The 60s was a defining moment. What I mean by that is it changed the country after, those things passed. And so I think we're just at another defining moment in this country that'll shape the country, I think, for the next, 30, 40, 50 years. And so we're going through that right now. And so I don't really worry too much about it. I don't like a lot of what's going on either. But at the same time, I think the country has to go through this. Eventually, there has to be a winner in these political arguments we're talking about. Because once there's a winner, to the victor goes the spoils. Then those folks will get to shape policy for a while. And that doesn't mean everybody else needs to go away. But then you're supposed to use the institutions we have in this country to deal with our differences, things like the courts, things like winning arguments in our legislative bodies to craft policy, to oppose policy of the people who were in power at the time. So, it seems like it, but our reference point is basically from the time that, we've been alive. And so that's why, I love to read. I love history, to go back. And when I do that sort of thing, I say, man, there's a lot of parallels here to what's going on today. And, I believe in this country. I believe that, it will survive and we'll move forward. I believe we'll be a better country afterwards. So I think we have to have the fight. We had to have the fight to secure our freedom from the crown. We had to have the fight to end slavery. We had to have the fight during the 60s, to shape the next 30, 40, 50 years. And I just think we're at that moment again in time, just a defining moment, defining period of time.
From your being out there and being around people and from your background, do you think that in some ways today there is an underground civil war going on in this country? Yeah, a little bit. You mentioned Washington. I believe Washington is a lot of the problem that's going on, and the reason I do is because they are disconnected from ground level. I'm at ground level, so when you say my experiences and the reference point I come from, I'm at ground level. I get to talk to American people. Which over the last 3 years, I've visited 40 states, and much of that was during the last presidential election. But I got to meet Americans from all walks of life at ground level. I got to talk to real people, and to one of the common themes that developed is people at ground level, people in what the elites in Washington call flyover states, and the elites in California, the flyover states in the middle of the country, they feel left out, that nobody's listening to them. When I say nobody, I'm talking about Washington, D.C., and it's because it is a bubble. And when you're inside that bubble, you're totally disconnected from what's happening back home. So, that's, I think, why we saw what we did in 2016. Someone came along and reconnected and resonated with people who felt that they were being left out. And, it added fuel to the fire of this period of time we're going through, because an outsider came in, a disruptor, President Trump,
was trying to set a new tone in Washington, D.C. It's a very difficult thing to do. That's a lot of the pulling and tugging that's going on. But I think that if you can keep the federal government from exercising more control over our daily lives, and let the states solve these things within the state constitution or within the constitution of those states, that's more at ground level. Who was it? Tip O'Neill that said all politics is local. He was right. It's at the local level where people can really be heard. We can't be heard in Washington, D.C. I'm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. You're in a different state. We can't be heard in Washington, D.C., but we can be heard in our state houses. We can be heard in our town councils, our county legislative bodies with the governors and the mayors and the town presidents, so on and so forth. And I think that's where a lot of this stuff can get done. And Washington needs to kind of like take a step back, and that's asking a lot.
Well, do you think one of the issues that we don't talk enough about is the power that people in Washington feel that they have the right to make decisions without really talking to the people that these decisions are going to affect?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. One of the things that bothers me is this shadow government that exists in Washington, D.C. that wields a lot of power. The shadow government being the administrative state. Okay, we have all of these federal departments and federal agencies that are behaving and acting in ways that are not, permissible by the U.S. Constitution. They haven't been elected. I'm talking about, the federal bureaucracy. These are people who haven't been elected to make these decisions. They even, dismiss our elected officials in Washington, D.C. in the Senate, the representatives and the senators, this administrative state. I'll give you an example. The Bureau of Land Management, fines people, fines ranchers out west for use of their private property. And, some of these people have gone to prison, federal prison. They've been convicted, through the court, the Department of, Department of Justice, but they're wielding power that the Constitution doesn't give them. And so, when you see that sort of thing go on, look at the IRS and look at what they were doing. They were accused of doing during the Obama administration when they were denying tax-exempt status to groups whose views that they oppose. That's not their role. It was never intended to be their role. And so when you see this sort of thing going on, there is an abuse of power, and it's because Washington has gotten so big. The federal government, and this is what's interesting, is this is what the biggest fear of the Founding Fathers was, an overreaching, overbearing central government being, the federal government, Washington, D.C. So here we are, presented with what the Founding Fathers most feared, and now we have to deal with it. I don't have the answer as to how you shrink the federal bureaucracy and federal government. People have gone in there and tried to do it. I know that Ronald Reagan, when he ran back in the 80s, said he was going to shut down the Department of Education. We don't need a federal Department of Education, Richard. Education is a local issue, and it should be dealt with at the local level, with school boards, school districts. The states should have a say in what goes on in terms of a education, the curriculum and so on and so forth, the spending, but we don't need a Department of Education. Why do we have a Department of Labor? Why do we have, let me give you another example. The Department of Agriculture out in Washington, D.C., they were created at a time when we still had a lot of farmers, over 250, 300,000 farmers across the United States. We were coming into the industrial age, but at the same time, we still had a lot of farmers. So the Department of Education started with about 2,000 employees. We had, 250,000 farmers. Today, we have about 25 to 30,000 large farmers, and the Department of Education has grown to over 20,000 employees. Why? And, these are the questions. This is how government grows. And if it grows, it becomes more expensive. This is what's frustrating people. People want to get back to more state control, more local control, the federal government out of their lives. But like I said, the power that they wield, they can destroy your life. The IRS can destroy your life. Department of Justice can destroy your life. It's kind of hard to take them on. They have unlimited resources. The average person does not, can't afford the lawyers. And it's caused a lot of frustration in this country. And that's why I said Washington, D.C. is a big part of the problem.
It's one of the reasons, David, that I am such a proponent of term limits, where you can't build a kingdom. Because I think sometimes some of these people have been there so long and they're so entrenched that they do have a power kingdom. And to me, that's one of the big issues that we face.
Yeah, I agree totally. Look, term limits, the popular thing at ground level with the people, with some federal term limits. States can enact term limits for state-held offices and local-held offices, but they can't with the federal government. Only Congress can do that. And you and I both know that Congress is not going to put themselves out of jobs. Career politicians are a problem. Public service has been turned into political service, and they can stay there forever. But that's why I think, I'm a supporter of this movement called the Convention of States. It's one of the ways that we can change the Constitution. And we can enact term limits through the Convention of States. Congress is never going to pass term limits. And like I said, put themselves out of work and put themselves out of business and shorten their careers. So, we're left with the few tools that the Founding Fathers gave us to change the Constitution, to put it in. That's what we'd have to do, to put it in the Constitution, because the Constitution currently provides for, the election of senators and representatives. And it's kind of interesting that they did put in, I shouldn't say the Congress passed term limits on the president after FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was in there, for 4 terms, died before the end of the 4th term. But, Congress did change the Constitution. That's how you have to do this. But they're not going to change the Constitution on something that's going to affect them negatively.
Yeah. I want to change the subject with you for a little bit because, 40 years in law enforcement. And when we look today, it seems like in the world of law enforcement, police today are under attack. What's going on? What is happening out there?
Yeah, what's happening is this war on cops, it's a weakening of the rule of law. Think about it. The police officer, sheriff's deputy, they're on the front lines of enforcing and protecting the rule of law. And there is a movement in this country to weaken the rule of law, to create chaos, to hopefully bring down this republic and then replace it with some creation of their own belief. And in order to do that, you have to weaken the rule of law. So attacks on police and other things like not using jails and prisons, normalizing criminal behavior, not using jails and prisons as crime control tools. These things are having devastating impacts at the local level, but it's being done intentionally. You look at some of the things going on where, in California, they enacted a law. It's legal for them to do this. They enacted a law that, changes the standards of when an officer can use deadly force, so to speak. And, that's got to be something that, a decision that's made in real time in circumstances that are tense, rapidly evolving, and uncertain. And it's a bang-bang situation, split-second decisions. And, a second or two can cause you your life as a law enforcement officer. And we have things in place. Remember when I said you got to use the existing institutions that we have? There's reviews of any police use of force that ends up being fatal. So we have those instances in place to do this. You can't make this thing impossible to do for law enforcement officers, which is going to have a negative impact moving to the future in terms of recruiting, in terms of people who think it's worth, because it's a sacrifice, and we do it willingly, right? Nobody is forced to be a law enforcement officer. We get into this willingly. We know the pay is going to be, there's going to be a ceiling on it. You aren't going to get rich, but you also know that there may come a day when, this thing costs you your life. Your loved ones are affected. The community is affected when a law enforcement officer is killed in the line of duty. But I'll tell you what, when you can't find people to do this, how the heck? Well, you have to lower the standards, because that's another offset of this war on cops, is you're going to have to lower standards of, for hiring, and you want the standards high, because it's awesome power and authority that we're giving our law enforcement officers. But when you can't find people, you got to lower the standards to get people in, and that's not a good thing either. So, as I watched this thing, and really when it I think it came to a head was in the ugly days after Ferguson, Missouri, when Officer Darren Wilson had to use deadly force to save his own life when he was attacked by Mike Brown, and the left, and that's who is behind this thing. Let's not kid ourselves here. They used that, they politicized it, they exploited that horrible situation. A riot ensued, and then as a result of that, riots were happening all across the country. We had one in Milwaukee, and every time the police did something, it came under examined by the microscope nationally. These are local issues. Let the local people sort that stuff out. People came in from out of town. They were busing people in to protest and to riot. They still let the good people of Ferguson, the city of Ferguson, the county there, I think this is St. Louis County, and the state of Missouri handle that thing. Stay out of it. When officers go outside of policy, when officers go to the dark side, so to speak, and engage in behavior we find reprehensible, there are things in place to rectify that. But, instead now the police officer has been dragged into the political arena, and now they're front and center, constantly under attack. This is not good for states and local communities. This is not good for America.
Do you feel, David, that this disrespect toward law enforcement today is really the majority of people that disrespect them are the minority, which is getting the media attention?
Yeah, this disrespect for police really starts with disrespect for the rule of law, disrespect for societal norms, so to speak. Look, the law enforcement officer is a symbol of the justice system here in the United States of America. I find it just shocking that, people think it's okay. And I'll define in a second who those people are, but people think it's okay to spit on officers, to fight officers, to resist officers, to attack officers in the performance of their duty. And at the same time would never think of going into a courtroom, which is also another symbol and aspect of our justice system, and disrespect the judge, right? You go into a courtroom, you're supposed to be quiet. It's yes, Your Honor. It's no, Your Honor. When the judge comes out, it says all rise. People stand up. When you go into a courtroom, you've got a hat on, you take it off. Those are things that people would never dream of violating, but at the same time, you take another symbol of the justice system, the police officer, and they think it's okay to attack, to spit on, so on and so forth. I find it's very disheartening, but once they break through the front line, the law enforcement officer is coming next to the courts. So, but let me touch a little bit on this disrespect for the rule of law and law enforcement officers. This started way before it reached the doorstep of the police. These are the same people who have no respect for their parents. They have no respect for societal norms. They have nothing but contempt for these societal norms and for respect. They're not respectful at home. They're not respectful in school. Teachers are under the same assault. It isn't just police. And, that goes on and on and on. But the thing is, it gets worse. And so if a person doesn't respect anybody at home, doesn't respect anybody in the neighborhood when they leave the house, doesn't respect anybody at school, these authority figures is what I'm talking about. Your parent, My mom and dad, they were authority figures. The teacher is an authority figure. When I was growing up, Richard, the neighbor was an authority figure. And so, as you disrespect your parents, as you did, and this is what happened in the Mike Brown situation in Ferguson, Missouri. Then he goes into a grocery store, Mike Brown, and he strong arms a grocery clerk. Then he goes out into the street. He's confronted by a law enforcement officer, and he was going to show his contempt for that authority figure, whether we like it or not. A cop is an authority figure. And then finally he came up against an authority figure that wasn't going to put up with that. And I bet Mike Brown was surprised, because every other instance that he had in doing that, everybody backed down, but the cop can't back down. So I think there's this aspect of society where there's no respect for a lot of things that is starting to grow and get worse. And like I said, if it breaks through the front line officer on the street, is coming to the courts. And watch the judge's reaction when someone decides they're going to act out in court and they don't give a damn. Watch the reaction. The judge will be shocked. Well, I'm shocked that people can get away with this with law enforcement officers.
Well, and this lack of respect seems to be supported in so many ways by making it a sensationalism. When they show the videos of the people dumping water and throwing water buckets at the police in New York and spitting on them and like that. And the more that is shown, the more it sends a message that you don't have to respect law enforcement.
Yeah, and also some of the weakening of the laws and ordinances that are passing in terms of, what's not allowed, and when people are confronted by the police. I think that sense. You throw a bucket of water on anybody. I mean, that's an assault. That's not an assault worthy of somebody, grabbing a stick or a gun and countering. But it is an assault. But what I mean by changing the laws and the ordinances is, there's no violation for that, they say. Well, yes, there is. And it used to be an assault on a law enforcement officer, and that was a serious thing when I was a kid growing up. You're charged with assaulting a law enforcement officer, you way cross the line. But when there's no consequences for this unwanted behavior, you're going to get more of it. And like you said, in our age where mass media is bigger and larger, people see that. Next thing you know, it catches fire. And next thing you know, you see more of it. And you see it in other areas. And that's how this stuff grows. But I think we have to get back to what's happening inside the home. And parent, you have to have more effective parenting. That's where I learned respect. And like I said, my mom and dad were my authority figures, my first ones. But that extended. And they gave that, that authority right, if you will, to the neighbor, to the teacher, and on and on and on, to the cop on the beat. Had the same authority in my eyes as my dad had over me, and how he demanded respect and discipline. And those other authority figures expected it too. And if I didn't reach it with them, came back to the home, and that's where it got taken care of. We didn't need police in schools when I was growing up. You probably didn't either.
No.
The teacher was the authority figure and carried the weight of what a police officer could do. Yeah.
And, there's two things you've said, and I really believe in it. One is that a lot of this goes back to the breakdown of the family. And I've always taken this back to the loss of the farm mentality, because when you were raised on a farm, you had a different set of rules, and there was a work ethic that went with that. And I think too many times in this country today, parents do too much for the kids. And one of the things that they do too much with is they don't monitor some of the video games that these kids are playing. I mean, some of these video games, when it comes to killing people, are so realistic. It's like they're actually there, and they're part of this. And the violence that has created, I think, has resulted in a lot of the violence that we see with young people happening in parts of our society today.
Yeah, there's some research done on that, and it suggests that sort of thing. There's an African proverb, I think Ghanaian from Ghana. It says, "The ruin of a nation begins in the homes of its people." And I think no truer words have ever been spoken. I think it starts there, and I think it has to end there. But what's happened is, in too many situations, we've absolved parents of their role and responsibility to raise their own kids, and we're turning to other things and other entities to have that happen. My dad would never have had to call the police on me. Okay, never. There would have been no need. I may have needed, if I would have really gotten out of hand, I may have needed to call the police on him, but he never had to call the police on me. The teacher didn't have to call. Richard, growing up in grade school, the police were never called to the school. Never. It just, you didn't need it. Why? The teacher, at the end of the day, if it got to that point, picked up the phone, called the parents, and the parents took care of it. So it always came back to the home, because it was their responsibility to discipline their kids, to punish their kids, so the teacher didn't have to punish. I mean, in that sort of way to correct that behavior. If you make you stand in the corner and that sort of thing, but you got worse than that when you got back home. So we've absolved parents of their responsibility and turned this over to, entities that really are ill-equipped and ill-prepared to do this. Teachers can't deal with this. The role of the teacher and what they're trying to accomplish in school is to educate kids, right? Teach them how to read, write at grade level, how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. Teach them history, teach them science, that sort of thing. It's to teach. It isn't the discipline. It's not the correct behavior. It's not to raise these kids, but that's who we're thrusting this on, daycare centers and, after school programs and all those sorts of things that are taking a place of what used to be the responsibility of the parent. And so we've gotten away from these these were time-tested things, all right, from a very long time ago, where everything, stemmed out of the home. And the homes needed help. There's no doubt about that. That's what schools were for. You sent your kid to school to be educated, not to be, have your kid be raised by the teacher or raised by this after-school program. So we've gotten away from things that worked, and we're experimenting now, and that's all these things are, experiments with these programs to try to bridge the gap and fill the gap left by ineffective parenting. But I'm telling you right now, it's not going to work, and we can see that. The results just aren't there.
Yeah. David, I got just a couple of minutes left, and I'd like for you to tell the people about your book, Cop Under Fire.
Yeah, I'm real proud of that. And it was one of my goals, by the way. My career goals was to be published, either a column or a book or something like that. And I was fortunate enough that a publisher picked it up. But what Cop Under Fire is, it's all these experiences that I've had through life. It isn't just a cop book. It's not just about cops and robbers. And it talks about the things that you and I have been discussing, for however long that we've been in this discussion. My upbringing, some of the experiences I've had, where I'm seeing where society's falling short. And it's also complete with suggestions on how we can remedy these things. The way I look at life, there aren't always solutions, but there are remedies that we can do to try to change course. The subtitle is Beyond Hashtags of Race, Crime, and Politics for a Better America. So it does deal and touches on those lightning rod issues, race, crime, and politics in America, but it offers more than a thumbnail sketch that you get from TV interviews and radio interviews and some of the columns I write. You only get so many words. So people only get sound bites when I'm on TV and I'm on radio and writing. They'll get sound bites from me. But what this book allowed me to do was go further into those sound bites you hear, my positions, my opinions, some of the stuff that I know that I'm passing on, the research, the data to support it. And that book is full of research and data, by the way, to support most of what I'm, just about everything that I talk about in the book. So I encourage people to get it. Amazon or your local bookseller, you can get it. People that have gotten it have told me it's a great read, and I know it's a great read. I had to write it, but I thought it would be of value to people just, looking over time and how did we get where we are today and what can we do to get back to those things that make America great.
David, if you had to end this show with one thought that you'd like to leave people with, what would that thought be?
Keep fighting, keep fighting for what you believe in and, have the courage and conviction to believe in something. And, life is a fight sometimes. It's a fight most of the time. But I find that if you keep fighting and not worry about how much, whether you're winning or losing or not, I tell people keep fighting. Every once in a while, look back and you look and say, man, look how far I've come. I had no idea because living in the moment, you don't think you're making progress. But if you believe something, stand up for it.
Sheriff David Clarke, my guest today on Let's Talk Human Behavior. And David, just thank you so very, very much for spending this time with me. I really appreciate it. I appreciate who you are. I appreciate the crusade that you're on, the mission you're on for your life, and the difference you're making in people's lives.
Richard, I appreciate it. I want to thank you for the use of your platform for me to spread the word.
All right, my friend, take care of yourself. And again, thank you.